Welcome, Anne, and what a joy, absolute joy it is to speak to you today. You gave the world an image of the feminine archetype, not as Eve, the fallen, sinful woman who brought about the demise of humankind, but instead introduced us to a whole lineage of regal and powerful goddesses stretching back to Paleolithic times. And you traced that history right through to the Virgin Mary. And you've shown us how, over the centuries, she gradually lost her divinity and was diminished. And your tireless work has been aimed at restoring this for us, bringing it back into the collective domain, and thus resouling our worlds. And in your new book, Divine Wisdom and the Holy Spirit, you recap and you pull all these threads together in a hugely impressive and scholarly way, which is worthy of many months and even years pondering. And I'm sure that book will be on my bedside table for a long time to come. And what I loved about it was that all is woven through with the most powerful channeled material. And also, some of the most sublime and exquisite poetry and sacred texts ever written. And you begin, and for this you devote an entire page. You begin with a quote from William Blake: "Everything is holy." And my first question is, can you tell us what inspired that choice of quotation?
I've always loved it. When we were doing the myth of the goddess, we realized that everything was holy, Jules and I, when we were
Yeah.
writing it. And I'm not sure it may be even in the myth of the goddess. I can't remember now. It's just possible that it might be. Anyway, it's always been with me. And when we were thinking of what to put, I had another quotation. I can't remember who from. And then I changed it and I wrote to the publisher and I said, we have to change it to this Blake one because this covers the whole thing, the whole panorama, and it might wake up people to the fact that they're living in a holy space. The whole planet is a sacred place, and the whole cosmos is a sacred place. So that's why I
Yes.
put it there. And Blake knew all this in advance in 17, whatever it was. Because of his intuition and his channeling, really, he knew the whole picture. And so I have tremendous respect for him and love of his poetry. Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, that everybody knows,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
other poems. And it just seemed right for the whole book. It just summed up the whole book.
Yes. I mean, that was my first feeling. It was like, what more do we need to know? It felt like the perfect distillation of, and it turned out to be so, everything that then followed. But you do also tell us that this understanding, this sense of connectedness to a kind of divine matrix, if you like, has been lost behind a great hedge of thorn, akin to the hedge of thorn in the fairy tale of the Sleeping Beauty. And it's this forgetfulness, you tell us, this dismembering in a sense, that's at the root of all our problems. And I wonder if you could talk us through the ideas that came to dominate the Western psyche and how they still are in that dominant position.
We are. And I can tell you what happened. Well, as you know, for some 20,000 years, possibly more, there was people worshipped the Great Mother because nature seemed to be the source of everything that they needed and experienced, the food, etc., and the shelter when they built shelters. And for a long time, the goddess, first of all, the Great Mother, who was connected with the lunar cycle, and then the great goddesses of Sumer, and Anna of Sumer, and Isis and Hathor, and Maat of Egypt, and Sekhmet as well, prevailed for a long time. Egyptian civilization lasted probably for 10,000 years, much longer than we know because of the pre-Atlantic, the pre-cataclysm situation. And then around first, then we had the Greek and Roman goddesses and gods, who were fairly well, not exactly balanced, because already the male was beginning to take over, and we had Zeus as the great father with all the goddesses as his daughters. That was the first
Yes.
sign of something changing. Instead of being great goddesses like Isis in their own right, they were the daughters of Zeus. And you also had the three dominant males, Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon, ruling the sea, Hades, the underworld. So that was the beginning of the change. You could see it creeping in. And
Mm.
with that went a lot of war already. Then you had the
Yes.
Trojan War and the gods and goddesses there. And then gradually you had around 2000 BC, a little bit after perhaps, you had the movement from the great mother to the great father. And the great
Yes.
father took over altogether. First of all, in the Babylonian civilization, when you had the god Marduk creating creating the world from the body of the slain goddess, the
Yes.
grandmother. That was the beginning, or a second beginning, if you like, of the change.
Yeah.
And that gradually moved until, with when I describe in Hebrew culture, you had the goddess actually obliterated. She was the consort of the god Yahweh in 623 BCE, but a group of priests took over the first temple in Jerusalem on the orders of King Josiah at that time and absolutely wiped out any trace of the goddess. They took her image from the temple and burnt it. They took the brass serpent, who was the symbol of her regeneration of life, destroyed it, and they destroyed all the little images that people had in the houses. Everything went. And every trace in the texts, according to this marvelous Old Testament scholar, Dr. Margaret Barker, who I've relied on totally for this period, they destroyed and changed the text in the 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, what's called the Pentateuch, and they changed any reference of either the goddess's name or goddess or wisdom. Anything to do with wisdom was erased or changed, or
Mm.
the words were actually changed by changing the syllables or even the letters of the words. Very
Yeah.
clever job. And probably they did it, I think, because of the Babylonian captivity, which came shortly after that period when many Jews were taken captive in Babylon. And possibly when they came back, the scribes were told to just wipe out every trace of any goddess because of the goddess
Yes.
Ishtar in Babylon. Do you follow me?
Yes, definitely. And the ancient mythology, which included a wonderful sacred tree, didn't it? And the dispensation of the fruits of immortality that were given freely. That when her sacred groves were destroyed, that myth, that mythology, that story was then reworked and recast and became for us the myth of the fall.
Yes, it did. That ghastly myth, which was, I didn't know when we were doing the myth of the goddess, Jules and I didn't know. We mentioned it in quite a lot of detail and said how awful it was. And there was one person we drew whose work called the Myth of Eve, I think it was called, by a wonderful man. Anyway, we knew about it in the Myth of the Goddess, but we didn't know the precise date. And Dr.
Yes.
Margaret Barker gave me the precise date,
Yeah.
623 BC, when
Yes.
this happened. And then they created the myth of the fall at the same time. And they gave
Yes.
the title of the former goddess, Mother of all living, marvelous title, to Eve.
Right. Yes.
So, and made up the whole story of how Eve was responsible for taking the apple, gave it to
Yes.
Adam, who then took it too, punished by God, then sin, guilt, etc., banished from the garden. What a God, what an image of God, you know?
Yes.
And yet people have treated this as divine revelation for
Yes.
2,500 years, when it was nothing of
Yes.
the sort. It was just a cock up of, sorry, not a cock up, but it was a cocked up plan
Yes.
by
Yes.
these priests to
Yes.
probably just take over the temple. They probably murdered the priest and
Yeah.
the new priest, and the new teaching was to follow the law of Moses, and it gave the title of um, the Jewish people were specially privileged, really, as children of God. That
Yes.
came from that period. And
yes,
it replaced the Old Testament wisdom teaching, love
yes,
wisdom teaching,
yeah,
completely, rubbed
yes,
it out. So that
yes,
I found so fascinating and so interesting that that gave me, after writing The Dream of the Cosmos, I said to myself, I have to get this into the public sector because it's too important to leave out.
yes,
Mainly,
yes,
I felt because of my bitter resentment of the proselytization of the myth of the fall, which I thought had done women such a bad turn, given
yes,
them cause to persecute women and even send them to the stake ultimately. This was all done by the Christian church, took it on.
yes,
Wonderful beat,
yes,
a wonderful club to beat women with. And,
yes,
and it lasted for, well, throughout the Christian era, or certainly
yes,
from the fourth century anyway.
yes, yes,
So,
yeah.
having got that off my chest, I think you can understand why I was so anxious to write the book.
Oh,
And this
definitely.
gradually came together with other things, and how really we've been misled about the nature of God for centuries.
Yes,
God is not as he's been presented. He's not a terrible father at all. And he has, or had, or should have, the feminine dimension included in the
yes,
Godhead. It was an
yes,
utter disgrace and typical of a male priesthood that they would get rid of the need
yes,
for the feminine
yes,
in the
yes,
God.
yeah, yeah,
And so we've been left with this, and the three patriarchal religions all worship this image of God as the Father without
yes,
the feminine. And
yeah,
that's why we're in the mess we are, because this image of God gives men the legitimacy to do really whatever they want and to go to war and kill people, all in used to be in the name of God or Christ, in the
yes,
conquest of the people in South America and elsewhere, etc. It was all done. The conquest was all done in the name of the Christian God.
yes,
That's
yes.
shocking.
Absolutely, absolutely. I also love the way in which, your book goes on to say that although centuries pass by, memories faded, but, as Jung says, nothing in the psyche ever goes away. And so this tradition found a way to come through despite all this suppression. And one of the traditions that you say is very important to you is that of the Kabbalah and the appearance of the feminine again as the Shekinah. And I've heard you say several times that this is a very special tradition to you. And you share with us the question that you asked yourself upon first encountering it. Why did I find this image of the Shekinah so nourishing to my soul?
Well, it came from a dream, as I also describe in the book, the dream of the feminine aspect of God. I didn't know her name when I was having the dream. That was about 40 years ago, or even 50 years ago, when I was in a Jungian analysis with Dr. Hella Adler. And she never interpreted that vision, because it was a vision rather than a dream. She let it just gestate in the psyche until I could come to the realization that there was no other goddess who filled the bill, really, except the Shekinah, for what I saw. It was so extraordinary, so powerful. She wasn't like Isis or any of the Greek goddesses. She was totally different. And so she led me to the image of the Shekinah in the Kabbalah, where the Shekinah is described as the feminine principle, as the divine feminine,
Yeah,
and given the same titles as the old goddess who was obliterated, divine wisdom and
yes,
the Holy Spirit. So it must have
yes,
been the same tradition going on.
yes,
And
yes,
I thought that was so important. I doubt whether, well, Jewish people know this. Some will know it now because I've been teaching it for some time. But that was really what led me to her. And then led me, I was also taught by Warren Kenton, who was a Kabbalist, a very well-known Kabbalist in England for most of 40, 50 years here. And
yeah,
he taught me, and he gave me the authority to teach Kabbalah if I felt inclined. But I didn't do that, but I put it in the
yeah,
book, what I understood
yes,
about it,
yes,
because I felt I had his authority behind me to do that. And
yes,
um, so that's the story, really, of how I came to the Shekinah. and how wonderful it was. It was like a second revelation to actually think, my God, this is the tradition that should be in the world and that's been
Yes.
taken out of the world and is put into a mystical tradition of
Yes.
Judaism. Um,
Yes.
Jews may know about it, but they may not, uh, all of them anyway, certainly don't know what it could mean to them. So I
Yes.
thought this was very, very important. And the descriptions are so beautiful that
Yes.
when you read them, that also
Yes.
caught me because it was in the tradition of the older book of Proverbs
Yes.
of beauty, this description of
Yes.
the relationship with nature and with everything. And also it tied back to the channel messages that my mother had years ago, 80 years ago, in which she was told to look for the stone beneath the tree. So I put two and two together and I realized that the stone was an image of the Shekinah. It was known to be
Yes.
the precious stone, she was called, and that
Yes.
the tree was the tree of life that she once was.
Yes.
So all these pieces fitted in the most marvelous way. And I took that as another revelation, really, because my mother and I had puzzled over that, saying, what did they mean? Did they mean we had to dig under different trees, which we did, hoping to find the precious stone? Um, and of course, we didn't understand then the mythological associations and also the meaning, the hidden meaning of things like that
Yeah.
sentence. But that was so wonderful that my mother's messages should have led me to this tradition.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
yeah, okay.
Absolutely. And some of the passages that you quote in these sections when you're writing, but just as you say, just absolutely breathtaking. And I wonder if you might allow me to share some of what you've written. I know it's a passage that you say is very special to you. And it's speaking of the beloved of wisdom, Solomon sings, I loved her above health and beauty, and I chose to have her instead of light. For the light that cometh forth from her never goeth out. She is more beautiful than the sun and above the order of stars. You
Yeah,
must have loved putting it together.
I did. And it always makes me cry, that passage, because it's just so beautiful. And the beauty comes down through 3,000 years. Solomon was 3,000 years ago. So it's just unimaginable. But somebody all along the way safeguarded these words and passed them
Yes,
on
yes,
generation by generation. And the
yes,
same with the book of Ben Sirah in the Apocrypha. And the book of Solomon is also in the Apocrypha. So these were carefully guarded and passed down. And that in itself is tremendously moving,
yes,
that human beings should do this, know
yes,
how important they were.
yes, yes, yes. I mean, your book is covers so much, but it goes on from here, tracking the light, as it were, as it has shone down through the centuries, and you cover huge amounts of time, right through the birth of Jesus, through early Christianity, through to the Essenes and the Gnostics, to Mary Magdalene and her incredible story, and onward to the 12th century France, to the Cathars and the Knights Templar. And then you also discuss, the light later being encoded within fairy tales and beautiful myths like the Holy Grail that enabled, again, when things had to go underground, that enabled these wisdoms to slip by, if you like, unthreatened and unnoticed. All carriers of the light, you say, Anne, of the ways and means of staying connected to this divine ground, as you say. It's such an incredible story that you weave together and tell. I wonder if there's anything from that huge part of your book that you'd like to pick up on here.
Well, I would like just to say, first of all, the Gnostics knew the truth. And there,
Yeah.
there were two strands, really, of Gnostic truth. One going back to Pythagoras and the pre-Socratic philosophers, and the other going back to this first temple in Jerusalem. Because the
Yes.
people in Jerusalem, when the Deuteronomist priests took over the temple, weren't happy. And many moved from Jerusalem to Alexandria.
Yeah.
And that formed the basis of the Alexandrian Gnostics. And so they, knowing the truth, when Christianity came along and people came to try and tell them about Jesus being later on being the only Son of God, they wouldn't accept that because they knew the truth. That first of all, that the whole thing was we didn't need redemption because we were already divine beings and
Yeah.
immortal beings. They knew that already in the first century and before. So that truth had to be safeguarded because the Christians persecuted the Gnostics, burnt all their gospels, and from the second to the fourth century, they were doing that. They were working against the Gnostics. So they had to go underground. And I think that what happened was, and wait a minute, I mustn't get in a muddle because it is very difficult to realize. Then, first of all, they also had the truth about Mary Magdalene being the wife of Jesus or the consort of Jesus, and they're working together to bring this through into the human community from this tiny place in Palestine where the Essene community lived, and to spread it all around as much as they could. And they also, what comes through the channel messages is that they had two groups. They had an outer group of men of 3 tiers and an inner group of 3 tiers of women. Now, that doesn't come through at all in the Gospels. So
Yes.
this I thought
Yes.
was so interesting. So
Yeah.
anyway, this was passed on, somehow went underground in the 4th century and went on till the beginning, probably the 11th or even the 12th century, when it began to resurface. And it resurfaced in this extraordinary Church of the Holy Spirit, or Church
Yes.
of Sophia, as it was called, in France.
Yeah.
Now, France was the place where Mary Magdalene had taken the Essene tradition in AD 45 and lived and taught there for 20 years.
Yes.
So there you had the roots of this resurgence in the 12th century, but all that
Yes.
time it had to stay underground because of the power of the church and
Yes.
also the power of the political power supporting the church all that
Yes.
time. Charlemagne, remember,
Yes.
was crowned in 800 um, in Rome as the Holy Roman Emperor. So he would
Yes.
naturally defend the church. He wasn't going to let anything change in his time, so
Yes.
to speak.
Yes. Yeah.
But it went on until the 12th century when it came up in the Church of the Holy Spirit. And also, the Holy Grail was a synonym for the divine feminine. It was just a disguise for the
Yeah.
divine feminine. So
Yeah.
people could embark on this quest, such a wonderful image, carried by the
Yes.
troubadours all through Europe.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
you had even Richard II in imprisonment, someone singing to him about these stories when he was in prison in Crac in France. Anyway, um, not in Crac, so I've got it wrong there, but you'll have to forgive me my mistakes because I get too
No
excited
problem. No
speaking.
problem.
And it
I mean,
was
you're
also,
right.
sorry, I
Sorry.
was carried by the Knights Templar. That was the other thing, because all this resurgence was formed by the Knights Templars, bringing the truth forward, bringing the divine feminine as the grail and serving it, building these extraordinary cathedrals
Yes.
with the help possibly of inner
Yes.
teachings, which they certainly had. They never gave
Yes.
their names. They were always called masters of the compasses, which is such a
Yes.
beautiful term.
How lovely.
And so
Yes.
they built these cathedrals. I think there were 11 of them, and they were all in the shape of the constellation Virgo in France. So
Yes.
they knew what they were doing. They
Yes.
were bringing back the
Absolutely.
feminine principle, but secretly, very cleverly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean,
And
you write with such compassion about these things, and obviously the Cathars were treated, as were the early Christians. They were treated abominably, weren't they, by the church, and during the Albigensian Crusade that was mounted against them, over 1 million Cathar
were
heretics,
killed.
as they were called, were murdered, and then the Inquisition followed, and that thoroughly wiped them
That
out.
followed on, yes, for 5 centuries we had the Inquisition
Yes,
from the 1300s until the 1800s.
yes,
But appalling. And there was a terrible book which I didn't put in my book called The Hammer of the Witches, It was called Malleus Maleficorum,
Yes.
Maleficarum, I think. And
Yes.
that was the testament which led the church to burn women to death because they took
Yes.
it as the proof that women were in touch with the devil.
Yes. Yes.
Unbelievable beliefs. I mean, this was a psychosis, really. We can now
Yes.
name it as a psychosis. I should have done that in
Yes.
the book, but
Yes.
because it most definitely was. And
Yes.
we have to watch out for that tendency to psychosis from anybody who gets in power.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Anne. Could I just return to those messages from the transcendent dimension, which was your previous book? And for those who don't know, it's basically a series of channeled messages from Yeshua and St. Francis that were given to your mother and I believe two other women beginning in the 1940s. And as part of those messages, your mother came to understand, as did you, your own personal deep connection to this love, wisdom tradition, and also to this Cathar region, the Languedoc, where I believe your mother lived as an older woman. And anyone following your work through the years, I'm sure would not be at all surprised to hear that maybe you had some deeper connection with all this than one can see at face value. And it seems that you grew up around these incredible channelings, and you had a sense of your own, your own service, what your own service would be. And although you say it took several, decades for you to hone it and to really work out what that would be, but an incredible connection there to the actual material that is the stuff of what you've written about.
Yes, well, I could see that all this stuff was about the waking of the sleeping beauty, and that the hedge of thorns was all these things that had blocked knowledge of her. And it's so clever of the people who made that story up
Yes,
to
yes.
disguise it. Wasn't it clever?
Absolutely, absolutely. It was the first fairy tale I ever adapted, and I mean, it just I just adore it. I mean, it kind of it was initiatory for me
Well, I think it
because I
was because,
suddenly thought, what is it?
yeah.
What is that beauty? And it took me on a lifetime's journey, really. This is so incredible, which actually brings me on to in because I know you discussed the Sleeping Beauty and Dream of the Cosmos, but in the new book you have a chapter about Cinderella,
Yes.
um, which I did really love. And you liken her to the soul estranged from the light, from her rightful inheritance, orphaned, living in the basement, covered in soot and ashes, completely unaware and cut off from renewal. Until she hears news of a ball that's going to take place nearby, and the fairy godmother turns up. And I wonder if you could pick up the story for us from there, Anne, and
Well,
tell us about the transformation.
it's such a clever image too to disguise the divine feminine as the fairy godmother. What could be cleverer
Yes,
than that?
yes,
But
yeah.
it didn't dawn on me until some years ago when I wrote I wrote that chapter, so to speak, as a piece to be published by some Jungian association. But I just love the whole story of how, first of all, the word goes out in the kingdom that there's to be a great ball where the prince will choose a wife from all the ladies of the kingdom. And the messenger comes to the household. And of course, Cinderella isn't really allowed to think about it. And of course, you won't be able to look at you, your ugly rags. You would never get the eye of the prince, say the two mocking sisters. And anyway, they get ready for the ball and off they go as best they could, dressed in whatever they could. And then Cinderella is left weeping in the ashes. And then her fairy godmother appears. I mean, what could be more marvelous as an image? And tells her what to do to transform, first of all, to create the coach and the coachman and the horses out of, I can't remember now, out of rats and mice and lizards, I think.
Yeah.
And anyway, that is all set up, and then changes her dress into the most beautiful dress and does her hair beautifully, obviously, as well. And off they go to the ball. And of course, she catches the eye of the prince, and they dance, and he falls in love with her. And then the fairy godmother had warned her, you have to always leave before the stroke of midnight, otherwise you'll be changed back into your old clothes. And so the first two nights, she goes the second night in a dress even more beautiful. I think the fairy tale says, first of all, like the moon and then the sun and then the stars, the dresses are like.
Yeah.
And anyway, with the third night, she forgets, she's probably enjoying herself so much, she forgets the godmother's warning and runs down the steps, but leaves a shoe behind her. And as she
Yeah.
changes back into her rags, and she runs home, and there are no more horses and carriage to take her home. So it must have
Yes.
been a long running course,
Yes.
I think.
Yeah.
And so the prince sends out all over the kingdom to find out whoever has the other shoe that he's got, so to speak. And finally, they come to the house of the stepmother, the wicked stepmother, and the two sisters. And the prince says, is there no one else here? And they say, oh, well, there's the girl who looks after the chimney there. And he says, well, let me see whether the shoe fits her feet. Because first of all, the two sisters, wicked stepsisters, have tried on the shoes, and they, in some versions, they cut off their toe or they cut off their heel to try and fit it in, their feet into the shoe. But finally, the shoe is put on Cinderella's feet, and of course it fits perfectly. And she brings the other shoe out of her pocket, so to speak, tries it on. So all is well. And so she goes off with the prince, and the sacred marriage takes place then. Of course, the
Yes.
sacred marriage is part of this
Yes.
story, just as it is of
Yes.
the Sleeping Beauty as
Yes.
well. Very
Yes.
important image that they didn't leave out of the fairy tales.
Yes.
And so there's a great celebration, and not unlike the Sleeping Beauty, where the whole court is asleep and then wakes up. In this one, they all just go to the ball and have a wonderful time and live happily ever after. But I just love that. Those two stories have been my
Yes.
favorites right from the age of 6, sort of thing, like with you, I should think.
Yes, and of course they still find their way directly into the heart of the home, don't they? And since the 17th century, I suppose, when fairy tales were relegated to the nursery, they still find their way into the nursery where they are beloved. And with innocent children, there's a kind of understanding. They are being presented, as you say, with this image of the sacred marriage, which has been denied in the dominant culture. But there
Absolutely.
it is for us, yes.
Yes, so it must have come from, I think, the Kabbalistic tradition. It must have been the Kabbalists who made it up,
Yes,
or the Gnostics. I don't know which, but
yes,
it passed down the centuries and eventually reaching out the children of our time.
yes,
And so important, carrying that archetypal imagery of the sacred marriage and also of transformation.
yes,
That's so
yes,
important as well. In both
yes,
stories, transformation is
yes,
important. In the Sleeping Beauty, it's the transformation of the prince as he works through this hedge of thorns, and then he gets
yes,
help at the last minute, and the
yes,
thorns turn to roses, and then he
yes.
goes into the chamber where she's asleep. But in the Cinderella story, it's slightly different. So, but
How interesting, Anne, that you say that the thorns turn to roses, because that is my subject of my next question, because your chapter titled The Sacred Way of the Rose was my absolute favorite chapter of the book. I mean, I just love it. And of course, the rose is the dominant symbol of the divine feminine in Western culture, isn't it? As you explain. And it fits so well with this in the context, this chapter, the sacred rose, within the context of this great flowering and flourishing of the feminine principle again in the 12th century with the courts of love.
yes, so Eleanor of Aquitaine was very absolutely key to this. And she possibly knew about this. Her father was one of the famous troubadours, Duke William of Aquitaine, and she would have been brought up with these stories. And again, she's in
Yes.
the southwest of France, exactly where Mary Magdalene was.
Yes.
I hadn't made
Yes.
that connection, but that's very important. And so
Yes.
the whole facility that she made of making her court a place where love was discussed, where beauty was honored, where
Yes.
good manners, where they called it prece parage, which is a lovely
Yes.
Provençal title,
Yes.
which means courtesy and
Courtesy.
courtesy, which is so lacking in our culture
Yes.
and has been
Absolutely.
lacking for a long time. Courtesy and respect for women and adulation of the woman as the carrier of wisdom and beauty, really.
Yes.
And so
I mean,
the troubadour
sorry.
extolled beauty as as a woman rather as the carrier of beauty and wisdom.
Yes.
Sapientiae, it was called Sapientiae.
Yes. Yes. Your presentation that you did on the way of the sacred rose for Ubiquity University for their Chart Academy, which was called Mystica Rosa, began with the sweetest troubadour refrain, which has been going round my head these last weeks as I've been immersed in your book. And it goes, whatever their ways, they're all in love with you. Each comes by a path to the rose garden. And I mean, you delight us in this chapter with so many mythological and literal examples of rose gardens. For example, you tell of your own first visit to the blissful gardens of the Alhambra in Granada that I know personally very well. You speak of the exquisite poetry of Rumi and the importance of the rose symbolism within that tradition. Courtly love, the troubadours, but also you speak of Cistercian rose gardens still kept today. I live very close to a Cistercian monastery, and they still have the most beautiful rose garden. You talk about the windows, the rose windows at Chartres, and you talk about Dante's exquisite mystic rose in the heart of the Paradiso. But one thing that really struck me was you say that sometimes it was impossible to distinguish between the poetry of the troubadours addressed to the lady from the devotions of the Cistercian monks to the Queen of Heaven, because both, you say, were sort of infused and had underlying the same erotic symbolism. And I found that so beautiful
Yes,
and
I
so
did.
freeing.
Yes, exactly. Well, Virgin Mary was, of course, of supreme importance as well. One mustn't forget her. And
Yes,
I just found writing about the rose was so um, sort of soul nourishing, I think, to trace it back to Isis and that wonderful story about Apuleius and
yes,
changed back from a donkey into a man. It was a
yes,
very funny story of him chewing the rose petals and then finding himself stark naked in the crowd when he turned
yes,
into a man. So from that story on, right the way through, you have the rose associated with the goddess in other
yes,
cultures. And so to this day, you have her carts adorned with roses in the Catholic countries as they
yes,
pull them through the streets. And you have above all, the association with the rose windows of Chartres.
yes,
That they were known, of course, when they built them, to be a symbol of wisdom,
yes,
not only of Christ and the Virgin in the center, but wisdom
yes,
herself
yes,
was the carrier of both
yes,
the Virgin and Christ as the
yes,
window itself, if you see what I mean. So
yes,
I
yes,
found all this so interesting. And Dante, of course, was aware of this through his own experiences. He must have had visionary experiences to write
yeah,
that extraordinary book in the first place.
yes,
And there's
definitely.
so much richness in past centuries that I think it's absolutely tragic that children are not taught anything at all today about any of this, about past civilizations. They're taught about
Yes,
the Romans of all civilizations to choose instead of the
yes,
Greeks, you know? Anyway,
yes.
I'm going off on my own tangent now, so come back to
No,
your question.
please do. I mean, I just wanted to return to your chapter on the way of the sacred rose, because you also mention, and you say it was a favorite book of yours, The Secret Garden.
Yes,
And yes, and the wonderful healing story that takes place in the Secret Garden, which is still available. It hasn't been banned yet. It's still available for
still
children
available.
to read, despite its strange references to the Raj, etc.
No,
It's
it's a
still possible.
magical story, a magical story. In Age of the Eight, I was reading it, and I'm still reading it at the age of 90, because
Oh, are you still?
yeah,
Yeah,
because it's as you read it, you taken into the magic of transformation,
yes,
and
yes,
the way the crippled boy is healed, the way the garden comes back to life. And in fact,
yes,
that reminds me, because before we wrote The Myth of the Goddess, Jules had a dream that she should contact me because she had a dream of a ruined garden that had to be restored. And
yes.
that was the trigger for The Myth of the Goddess.
That's amazing, and that was I was going to ask you about that. I had a note about it, but how incredible to have such a dream, and how perfect a metaphor is that, an abandoned garden in need of restoration. Of course, that is what you've done. I mean, I'm minded of the quotation that you use in the chapter, which is from Alchemy. In the final stages of alchemy, you say the rose opens in an absolute ecstasy of love and compassion for all. This chapter to me, Anne, it just feels holy to me. I have to say there are no other words to express how I feel about it. It just feels so beautiful to me.
Now, that's
And
lovely to hear,
yes,
because to me also the rose has always been special. And when I came to live here in England, where I am now, my first thing was to plant rose bushes everywhere. They don't do very well on moist soil, unfortunately, which is chalk.
yes,
They like
yes,
clay soil, but anyway, I have as
yes,
many as possible. I've got one called Awakening, which was one chosen by Prince when he was Prince Charles by the King. This rose called Awakening, very beautiful pink rose, and there are other ones with marvelous titles. I put that in my book, The Dream of the Cosmos. It's in the
yes,
first chapter, My Attraction to
yes,
the Rose, and
yeah.
that
Yes,
and that quotation from Walter de la Mare: "No one knows through what wild centuries rose back the rose."
oh, that's
That's
so
really,
lovely.
yeah.
So lovely. And you've chosen the emblem of the rose for the cover of the new book as well.
Yes, I did, because I chose a pink rose which somebody sent me, a most beautiful pink rose for the messages. And so I wanted to follow on with a red rose, and my publisher happened to have that rose in his garden. So
Yes,
he is on the inner rose tradition as well.
yes, yes. How lovely. Following that chapter, Anne, you have a chapter called Healing the Heart, in which you again revisit the devastating impact on the collective psyche of the wound inflicted by the mythology of the fall. And you present to us the image of a wounded child still present in the collective psyche in dire need of healing. And you ask, how might this be done? How might this be done?
Well, by become conscious of the wound that this myth is inflicted, and getting rid of it as soon as possible, not teaching it to children. Unfortunately, Christian parents will probably teach it to their children and imbue them with the idea of sinfulness, which is a total catastrophe, because we're not sinful people. We may be unconscious people, but we're not born sinful. Certainly, the
Yeah,
child is not sinful.
yeah,
So there's a great deal has to be done in the educational sense, and in a way, the present stage of the death of God is not a bad thing, because it's making us rethink everything, and in the sense that I've been doing in my book, and it's probably making a great many other people rethink, and they
yes,
may reach different conclusions, but at least it gives us the space to reformulate our image of God, and
yes,
to think what God really does mean, and certainly not the image we've inherited.
yes, yeah. Your two penultimate chapters on the abuse of power bring us again face to face with darkness that currently still threatens us in our world, and they really do stand as a stark warning. You've always been very vocal about the atrocities of what might be called the last throes of patriarchy. You've spoken at length about the disastrous consequences of splitting the atom, the perils of nuclear proliferation, and now in the new book, the great threat of the new globalists, the unseemly power of the large pharmaceutical companies, and the perilous advance and promotion of transhumanism. And I wondered if you could tell us how big a threat do you see these developments, and also what can we as sentient beings do to preserve our own integrity and sanctity amidst this onslaught?
Well, it's a very good question and a very important one. I think, first of all, I included them against the advice of a man who'd helped me with the whole book. He said it will spoil the book. And I said, I'm going ahead. I consulted David Lorimer and another great friend, should I go ahead? And they said, yes, you must go ahead, because I wanted to warn people of the danger that we're in and the inconceivable evil of what has been planned. And I think people need to know the depths of evil that is actually confronting us. And in being forewarned, they can know how to avoid being taken over by this, which will be done through technology. That is the danger, that we're already so involved in technology, all of us with our internet and our Zooms and our mobile phones, etc., that it'd be quite easy to just set up a kind of prison system through the use of technology. So we have to be very aware what's being done. For instance, the installation of these new 4G and 5G masts, they are not exactly what they seem. People need to go into that. They can't stop the government putting them up, but they can protest when they're put near them. There mustn't be
Yes,
any homes or schools, that sort of thing. And
yes,
secondly, they must be aware of any attempt to take over the banks by technological means, and therefore they would take over all our accounts, and we would lose everything that we have, and we would be prisoners. I've got a picture of actually a prisoner behind the bars in my book, and also sheep being driven into a pen,
yes,
because this is what the transhumanists hope, that we will be like sheep, that they can drive into a pen and then take over control of the world. It's the most insane inflation from a Jungian point of view. I mean, it's a psychosis,
yes,
really,
yes,
a psychosis. And we need to recognize that it is a psychosis and be aware of the signs. And there
yes,
are signs already, which I'm not going to go into in this interview, but they're in the book, in that chapter,
yes.
that particular chapter, which is chapter 12, I think. Um,
Thank you,
before
Anne.
that,
And I,
warning me. And I think that, yes, the major danger is technology, the danger to our homes, our money, our livelihood, and even our food. They would control what we can eat and where we can buy it and all that sort of thing.
yes,
So the more people can grow their own food, the better. Vegetables and things like that.
yes,
Being prepared, because this was planned to come over around 2030. That was the general plan, and then more further on. And there is a book I mentioned in that chapter by somebody, oh God, I can't remember his name offhand, ending with James. His first name is something else, but James. He's written a book which describes the whole plot and the plan, and also a man in America called the doctor, oh dear, my memory's gone again, who spoke at the European Parliament. He warned there that this plot was in process of developing,
was
and that
that Mike Eden?
no, he's an
No.
Englishman. This was
Yes,
American. I just cannot remember his name, but his talk at the Union is actually on my website under my playlist, so people could listen
yes,
to it there. And he calls what has happened with COVID um, a complete plan to kill as many people of us as possible. They want to kill so that we're only left with 500,000 on the planet. So that's a huge plan of
absolutely,
an unbelievable plan to get rid of
absolutely,
so many
absolutely.
billions of people, 4.5 billion people. And the trouble is with COVID, um, there is a danger of long-term injuries. We've seen people dropping dead, young people dropping dead on the playing fields and that kind of thing. But we haven't seen the long-term effects, say, on the heart, on the cancers that are coming up now. That's another feature about them. We have to really be aware. And there are cures for cancer that I can't mention in my book, but they can be found. And I know about them if anybody wants to contact me. And there are doctors who are working on that. There's a man called Dr. Angus Dalgleish. He's one, Angus Dalgleish. He's a Scottish doctor who works in London, actually. And he has come up with ivermectin as one of the things that can be used as a treatment for cancer. But there are other things as well. So, I mean, all of this was a plot beyond the capacity of to imagine that people could behave in like this or think like this. But also, if you take the whole history of the church, you can see the same theme of power corrupting.
Yes, yes, power over. You're so brave and bold to speak out in this way, but I can really understand why, you had to ponder the question, shall I include these chapters or not? But how bold and how brave of you to speak out, and I admire that greatly.
Well,
Can we come on to, sorry.
I think I've mentioned the second chapter on transhumanism, because that's another thing that is plotted and planned and getting going. The idea that we can improve our species by having different genes added to our core, whatever it's called, I can't remember it now. But to be aware of any implants that young people would be encouraged to put under their skins, never to allow children or grandchildren to do that. No implants of any kind, because that can change the genetic makeup.
Yes.
And once they've done that, you're no longer the same species. We
No.
haven't got the same DNA. We would have a different DNA, and we couldn't ever go back to what we are now.
Yes.
That would be utter tragic, because we're such a wonderful species. We've got so many, many gifts. And
already we're already connected in, aren't we, to, as you say, as you've said for years and years, we're already connected in to Indra's net, to this divine matrix, to the whole cosmos. We're already, we have the divine spark. We're already connected. We're already marvelous, amazing creatures, as you say.
Yes, when you look at the capacity to build something like Chartres in the 12th century,
yes,
and you look at the hideous buildings that are being built now, you can see how we've deteriorated. We're really at the bottom of the scale, and it only needs a few thousand or million people to wake up to be able to get hold of all this thing and change it. It has to change. We have to create a better civilization, which we have to create the new human, which would be the human who is conscious of all this.
Yes.
And my friend Christopher Bache, whom I quote in the last chapter, he, with his visions and his experience of going into the heart of the cosmos, he's brought back a treasure of wisdom for us, which I try to put into the last chapter.
Yes.
And all this is there inherent within us. We just have to recognize it and wake up in time.
Yes. You begin your final chapter with a quote from Dostoevsky: "The world will be saved by beauty," which I found, after reading the two previous chapters, I found that so wonderful, and also the title, the sacred marriage, this notion of everything coming together, as we've said previously, in this image of the ancient sacred marriage, the alchemical wedding, even the weddings at the end of fairy tales, this coming together and blending. And I just love that so much. So I was very reassured, because I wasn't sure where you were going to go after those two chapters. But I couldn't have been happier when I read that quotation: "The world will be saved by beauty." But as I read on, this is my final question now, Anne. As I read on, and being a writer myself, I kept wondering, I wonder what she's going to do at the very end, You know, what is she going to have at the last few pages? You know, bearing in mind that, as you've said, this is most possibly your final book. So these could be, in fact, your final printed words. Maybe, could be. And I wondered, that's quite a responsibility, how to choose. But again, I couldn't, I was absolutely blown away by your choice, because what you did was you didn't use your own words. You again quoted from the messages from a transcendent dimension, the words of Yeshua, St. Francis, telling us how we might free ourselves from grip of darkness and embrace the eternal light. And if it's okay with you, Anne, might I share something of what you wrote on the last couple of pages or quoted? You write, quoting messages from a transcendent dimension. The soul is like an instrument. It is tuned or it rings flat. When your soul is harmonious, it can vibrate with all the vibrations of spirit and take part in the wonderful concert of the universe. And then you go on to say, create gardens to protect the purity of nature from all the destructive ways, protect the birds, tell people about angels, and make the stars weep for joy. I mean, just such sublimely beautiful words, Anne. Breathtaking, breathtaking. What a finish.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for being someone who understands what I've been writing about and who really can take it on board as a writer yourself and as a person who's been on this quest herself. So it's a great privilege for me to be interviewed by you and to be asked all these questions because I can respond to what is coming from your heart. It's so important, heart to heart. That is the cultivation of the wisdom that we need to engender to create a new civilization. It's to speak
Yes,
from heart to heart and act from heart to heart. So I think
yes.
that's all I can say.
It's been an absolute privilege to read every single word that you've written over these long, long years. And my own conclusion is to bow to you, dear Anne Baring. I bow to you and thank you from the bottom of my heart for your service, your very great service.
Well, thank you. I think I've been guided all the way without knowing it from childhood, probably the age of 13. And I feel I have accomplished what I came to do. But as I say, to have somebody who can appreciate what I've done and why I've done it is a gift beyond imagining for an author. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.